The desert shimmered with heat, the kind that made the horizon dance and the air taste like dust and brass. The rifle range stretched wide and flat, a long scar of sand and targets under the pitiless sun. Young Marines stood in formation, their faces slick with sweat, boots grinding into the gravel. The rhythmic echo of shouted commands and rifle bolts snapping open filled the air like percussion. Staff Sergeant Cole stalked the firing line like a wolf among sheep, his voice cutting through the heat, sharp, impatient, and self-assured. "Get that muzzle downrange, recruit. You trying to ventilate your own foot?" His words cracked like the desert wind, drawing nervous laughter from a few of the newer faces. Cole thrived on that, the little flinches, the quick apologies, the way they scrambled to please him. He called it discipline. In truth, it was control, and he enjoyed every second of it. The recruits, raw and obedient, clung to their rifles as if the weapons could somehow make them worthy. The metal burned against their palms. Sand mixed with gun oil and sweat. It was the kind of day that tested patience and made tempers brittle. Then the range officer gestured toward the approaching figure crossing the sand. The man walked without hurry, a slow, deliberate gait that seemed almost defiant in its calmness. His uniform wasn't regulation issue, faded BDUs, boots that had seen more years than most of the recruits combined, and a ball cap so sun-bleached the logo was barely visible. A laminated volunteer badge hung crooked on his chest. "This here's Mr. Grant," the range officer said, wiping his brow. Retired Navy, volunteered to give a few words to the platoon about long-range shooting and, old-school craftsmanship. The recruits murmured politely. Cole didn't bother to hide his smirk. "Wonderful," he muttered. "A museum exhibit." Grant reached the firing line, nodding to a few of the young Marines. His eyes were steady, gray like weathered steel, and though his body moved with the stiffness of age, there was a precision in it, the economy of someone who never wasted motion. He didn't speak at first, just surveyed the rows of shooters, the targets downrange, the wind flags shifting lazily in the heat haze. "You're shooting uphill against the wind," he said quietly to no one in particular, his voice low but cutting through the ambient noise. "You'll want to adjust your sights a click right and down a hair." A few recruits blinked at him. One followed the advice, hesitated, then squeezed off around. The bullet punched the target cleanly dead center. Heads turned. Cole's jaw tightened. "Lucky shot," Cole barked. "Don't read too much into it." Grant's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, not quite a frown. "Luck," he said softly, "runs out about as fast as confidence does." The recruits chuckled under their breath, and Cole's eyes snapped toward them, silencing the laughter in an instant. He turned back to the old man, measuring him like a problem he intended to solve. "You a Marine, Mr. Grant?" "Navy," Grant replied simply. "Back when the water was colder and the radios heavier." Cole snorted. "Figures. You old-timers all got stories. Vietnam, right? Special something or other?" Grant nodded once. "Something like that." Cole folded his arms. "Well, this isn't story hour. Out here, we train for modern warfare, not nostalgia." The recruits shifted uneasily. There was something in Cole's tone that felt more hostile than professional. But Grant didn't rise to it. He just looked at the targets, the dust, the mirage dancing over the range. "Funny thing about war," he said after a pause. "Doesn't matter what century it is, the bullet still flies the same way." That line hung in the air like smoke. A few recruits nodded slightly, almost involuntarily. Cole's smirk returned, brittle now. "We'll see if your old tricks hold up, Grandpa. Don't want the kids getting any bad habits." Grant's expression didn't change, but something quiet passed behind his eyes, a memory, perhaps, or a challenge unspoken. He gave a slow, respectful nod. "Then I suppose we'll both learn something today, Sergeant." The sound of distant gunfire filled the pause between them. The recruits exchanged uneasy glances. The sun pressed down, relentless. Cole turned away with a dismissive wave, already plotting the lesson he'd make of this man before the day was over. Grant remained at the edge of the line, hands clasped behind his back, watching the targets shimmer in the heat. There was no anger in him, no pride, only that same steady calm, the kind that made men like Cole nervous, because they couldn't shake it. He adjusted the brim of his worn cap against the glare and waited. The day wasn't done with him yet. The desert had its own rhythm, punishing by day, hollow by night. The base felt different now that Alara Quinn had been moved to Bravo 8, the unit everyone whispered about but never volunteered for. It wasn't a platoon so much as a dumping ground, recruits who'd mouthed off, failed tests, or just rubbed the wrong officers the wrong way. The unwanted and the untrusted. The ones too stubborn to quit. They met her arrival with the same wary silence they gave every new face. Her transfer orders were stamped disciplinary reassignment, and that was all they needed to know. Coleman, the unit's commanding sergeant, read it with a slow grin that didn't reach his eyes. He was the kind of man who fed on hierarchy, sharp jaw, polished boots, the sort of officer who measured worth in obedience. "Well, look at that," he said, voice dripping amusement. "The golden girl from logistics. Welcome to the dirt, Quinn. Out here, we don't do coffee breaks and clipboards. You pull your weight or you sink." Alara said nothing. She stood at attention, expression blank, eyes forward. Her silence made him uneasy. He wanted pushback, something to break. When none came, he sneered and turned to the squad. "Don't get comfortable. She's not one of you. Keep an eye on her bag. I don't want any surprise paperwork showing up." Laughter rippled through the group. "Yeah, we'll monitor it, Sarge," one recruit said. From that moment, her rucksack became the running joke of Bravo 8. It was checked, weighed, inspected not by protocol, but by mockery. Days blurred together in heat and dust. They trained until their knuckles split and their backs ached. When the others cursed, Alara stayed quiet. When they stumbled, she steadied. Her movements were deliberate, efficient, unnervingly composed. Coleman noticed it, but dismissed it as stubborn pride. The first real test came at the end of the week, a 20-kilometer endurance run with full packs, followed by a timed obstacle course. The sun was merciless, baking the air into a haze that shimmered over the sand. Coleman gathered them at the start line, pacing like a man preparing for a show. "Let's see who still wants to wear this uniform by sundown," he barked. His gaze landed on Alara. "Try to keep up, admin girl." The horn sounded. By the halfway point, recruits were dropping first from heat, then from pain. Coleman shouted at them, spurred them on, but his voice grew hoarse. The wind carried only the crunch of boots and the ragged sound of breathing. And through it all, Alara moved like water, steady, silent, unhurried. Her breathing never changed, her stride never faltered. By the time the others stumbled across the finish line, she was already standing there, eyes on the horizon, her uniform streaked with sweat and dust, but her posture unbroken. Coleman stopped cold when he saw her. "When the hell did you?" 15 minutes ago," said one of the observers quietly. The sergeant said nothing. Around them, recruits collapsed into the dirt, gasping. Alara simply knelt, untied her boots, and began to retie them with mechanical care, as if she'd just finished a morning jog. The silence that followed wasn't respect, not yet, but unease. Something about her didn't add up. That night, the mess hall buzzed with a new rumor. Someone swore they'd seen MPs at the armory earlier, hauling out Alara's pack. Something about a sensor alarm. No one knew what set it off, only that the MPs who checked it were quietly reassigned before the evening meal. By lights out, every table had its own version of the story: explosives, encryption gear, black ops clearance. No one knew the truth, and Alara didn't correct them. When she entered the hall, conversations dipped into uneasy silence. She got her tray, sat alone, and ate without looking up. Coleman passed behind her and muttered, "Enjoying your dinner, mystery girl?" She didn't respond. That only made him angrier. Later, in the dim glow of the maintenance bay, she sat at a steel bench cleaning rifles with quiet precision. The smell of oil and metal filled the air. One of the recruits, a wiry kid named Miller, lingered nearby, fidgeting with a disassembled barrel. He kept glancing at her, curiosity gnawing at his caution. Finally, he spoke. "What's in the bag, Quinn?" She didn't answer. Her hands moved with practiced ease, reassembling the weapon, sliding the bolt with a clean click. He tried again. "People say you're not supposed to be here." that the brass don't even know what unit you were in before this. Is that true? Elara looked up at him for the first time. Her eyes were pale and unreadable, the kind of look that made you feel like she was seeing too much. Who are you? Miller asked, quieter now. Elara's voice was almost a whisper, steady as the rifle in her hands. No one you'd believe. The words hung in the air, quiet and final. She slid the rifle back onto the rack, wiped her hands, and walked out into the night, leaving Miller alone with the echo of something he couldn't explain and the uneasy realization that whatever she was, she hadn't come here to fail. The air on the range had changed. The heat still shimmered above the sand, but it was no longer just sunlight pressing down on the recruits, it was the weight of silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint metallic ring as the pieces of the shattered M14 clinked together in Mr. Grant's weathered hands. He gathered them gently, as if handling the remains of an old friend. The splintered wood was jagged, the receiver cracked clean through. It had survived decades, war, salt air, time, only to die here under the careless strength of a younger man's pride. Grant didn't look angry. That unsettled everyone more than rage ever could have. His calmness felt deliberate, like the stillness before a storm that knows exactly where it's going to land. He brushed sand from the broken rifle and set the pieces on the bench with reverence. Then he straightened slowly, turned towards Staff Sergeant Cole, and spoke in that same quiet, controlled tone. Mind if I borrow yours, Sergeant? The words were soft, but they carried. They sliced through the desert air like a blade. Cole's smirk faltered for half a heartbeat, then came back twice as wide. You want to shoot my weapon? He laughed, glancing at the recruits, inviting their laughter too. Be my guest, old man. Just don't break it trying to figure out where the safety is. He held out his M27 infantry automatic rifle with exaggerated care, barrel tilted away as if offering a relic to a child. The recruits exchanged uncertain looks. A few of them, the sharper ones, had noticed how Grant had handled the old M14 earlier, the way his hands had moved without thought, like muscle memory older than their parents. But no one said a word. Grant accepted the rifle. His hands were slow but sure, veins standing out like cords under sun-worn skin. He turned the weapon over once, eyes scanning it the way a mechanic might study a new engine. Then, with a small click, he popped the magazine, checked the chamber, and reseated the mag with a single smooth motion. Every gesture was quiet, exact, too exact for someone just familiar with weapons. Cole crossed his arms, grinning. Careful, pups. That's a modern system, not your museum piece. She'll bite if you don't. But his voice died as Grant adjusted the optics and flicked the fire selector to semi without hesitation. The old man lowered himself to the ground, prone position, elbows set perfectly in the sand. His movements were precise, measured, not just trained, but earned. The recruits instinctively stepped back. Something about the moment felt wrong to interrupt. Even the spotter in the tower leaned forward, binoculars raised. Grant inhaled once, slow, deep, steady. Exhaled. The sound of his breath carried louder than it should have. Then the rifle cracked. One round. Then another. Each shot was spaced perfectly, like the ticking of a metronome. The muzzle barely moved. 10 controlled bursts, 10 sharp reports that rolled across the range and faded into the stillness of the desert. The smell of cordite hung in the heat. The spotter's voice finally broke the silence, coming through the speaker in a disbelieving stammer. Target 1. All 10 hits. All center mass. 2 through the same hole. No one moved. A bird somewhere in the distance called once, and even that sounded hesitant. Grant stayed prone for a moment longer, then calmly engaged the safety and set the rifle beside him. He sat up with a faint groan, the only concession to age he allowed, and dusted off his knees. Cole's grin was gone. His jaw flexed uselessly, a tick of disbelief. He turned toward the targets, squinting as if distance could lie. The recruits watched him, waiting for something, an order, a joke, anything to fill the vacuum Grant's silence had created. Must have been luck, one recruit muttered weakly. Grant stood, eyes on the horizon. Luck, he said, that quiet voice carrying again, only gets you one shot. Cole opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. He knew enough about marksmanship to recognize what he'd just seen. 10 rounds, center mass, 2 through 1 hole, not fluke, not muscle memory. Mastery. The kind that came from years of repetition, from lessons written in blood and sand. Grant picked up the rifle, walked it back to Cole, and held it out stock first, the gesture formal, almost old-fashioned. "Good weapon," he said simply. "Clean trigger, balanced recoil. You take care of it, it'll take care of you." Cole took it back automatically, his hand brushing against Grant's. The calluses there were rough and deep, the kind that no amount of retirement ever really softened. The old man turned to the recruits. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with something between respect and awe. He gave a small nod to them, the kind of gesture soldiers understood instinctively, then walked toward the bench where his broken M14 lay. He gathered the fragments into the case, slow and deliberate. When he closed the latches, it sounded final, like the end of something sacred. Behind him, the recruits began whispering again, their voices low, uncertain. Cole stood rigid, rifle at his side, staring after the old man with the uneasy realization that he hadn't just been shown up. He'd been reminded of what real command looked like, and it wasn't loud or proud or cruel. The range was quiet again. The wind moved across the sand, and where arrogance had stood, only silence remained. The sun had begun to tilt westward, softening the edges of the range and turning the sand a deeper gold. The smell of gunpowder still lingered, but the air felt quieter now, almost reverent. Grant rose slowly, one knee at a time, brushing grit from his palms. His joints protested, but his movement had the same calm precision as before, deliberate, unhurried. Without a word, he picked up the M27 from the ground, held it out by the stock, and offered it back to Cole. The sergeant didn't speak. He took the rifle automatically, his expression unreadable. His hands trembled slightly as he checked the chamber, as though verifying what he'd just seen hadn't been a dream. Grant's eyes held his for a fraction of a second, not accusatory, not triumphant, just quietly knowing, before turning away. He walked back to the bench where the broken pieces of his M14 waited in the sand. The recruits parted instinctively as he passed, standing a little straighter, eyes tracking his every movement. The old rifle lay in pieces, the splintered stock, the cracked receiver, the metal worn thin with years of care. Grant knelt and gathered each fragment with the tenderness of a craftsman collecting something irreplaceable. His hands were steady. He placed each piece into the battered gun case, closing it with a muted click that seemed to echo louder than a gunshot. He didn't look at anyone as he latched it shut. Didn't make a speech. Didn't explain. He simply stood, adjusted the brim of his sun-bleached cap, and began walking toward the perimeter fence, boots crunching softly in the dust. The recruits remained frozen in place, rifles idle at their sides, the silence between them filled with a strange, heavy awe. They'd come expecting a story about old wars, maybe a demonstration from a relic of the past. Instead, they'd seen something none of them could quite put into words, mastery stripped of ego, discipline without noise. It was the youngest recruit who broke the silence. He couldn't have been older than 19, freckles still faint under the layer of sweat and dust. His voice cracked as he called out, "Sir, can you teach us how you did that?" Grant stopped mid-step. The desert wind whispered faintly through the firing line, carrying the question forward like a prayer. He turned his head, just enough for them to see the faint curve of a smile beneath the shadow of his cap. "Starts with listening," he said. His voice was soft, almost drowned by the wind. Then his eyes flicked briefly toward Cole. "And ends with remembering who taught you." For a long heartbeat, no one moved. The words sank in like stones dropped into still water. Grant gave a single nod, acknowledgement, farewell, maybe both, and continued walking. His figure grew smaller against the horizon, swallowed by the waves of heat rising from the sand. Up in the control tower, Colonel Dawson had watched the entire scene unfold. He lowered his binoculars slowly, eyes narrowing at the sight of the retreating figure. A man like that didn't need to raise his voice to command respect, it followed him like a shadow. The colonel turned to the range officer beside him. "Get Cole to my office," he said quietly. "Now." Down below, the order reached the firing line within minutes. Cole's shoulders stiffened. The recruits didn't look at him, didn't smirk or whisper. There was no satisfaction in their faces, only a kind of quiet reckoning. Cole adjusted his cover, jaw tight, and walked off toward the tower, the echo of his boots oddly small against the weight of what had just happened. The rest of the platoon stayed rooted where they stood, staring downrange. The targets still fluttered faintly in the distance, riddled with neat, perfect holes, 10 in a tight cluster that seemed almost impossible. It wasn't just accuracy, it was something deeper, something that didn't belong to drills or checklists. Mendoza, the spotter, lowered his scope and exhaled. "Never seen shooting like that," he muttered. The others didn't answer. They just stared at the paper target until the sunlight caught it and made the holes glow white. No one would ever talk about it in the mess hall, not loudly anyway. But every recruit who stood there that day would carry the image with them long after the dust settled. The old man's steady breathing, the rhythm of his shots, the stillness afterward. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't demanded respect. He had simply earned it the way men used to, when the measure of a soldier wasn't in how loud he barked orders, but in how well he could aim, act, and endure. Long after Grant's figure disappeared beyond the range, his words lingered in the air, woven into the quiet. Asterisk starts with listening. Ends with remembering who taught you star. For a moment, the recruits almost believed the desert itself was listening too.